today I actually want to bring some of the serendipity science and serendipity research itself that Peck was introducing you to a lot of the really good, long tradition of looking at serendipity in science and elsewhere. And then I'm going to bring it forward and to talk about its role in cognitive science. And I'm going to talk specifically about strategy. And strategy comes into play actually in Robert Merton's definition from his studies of empirical research and the serendipity pattern, which is one of my favorites. So cognitive science in general, just to introduce us to the topic, is looking at our understanding of how we think. Now, part of that understanding has been really closely tied to where we think. And many of you are involved in externalist approaches to cognitive science and to cognition, and or embodied approaches, you know, the good old 4 E's. But also, there's the kind of in-brain neuroscience aspect, and I'm gonna touch on that history and tell a little bit of a story of how serendipity has played a role in the evolution of cognitive science as we know it today, and also how serendipity plays a role in our cognition. And then I'm going to add a third layer because it's fun and talk about how serendipity plays a role in our thinking about how we think and where we think. Let's see if this works. Great. So I'm going to start with a nice classic case, which is Phineas Gage. Many of you might have heard of Phineas Gage. So very briefly, you can see here on the slides that it's called a tamping iron. Phineas was working in a rail line, building the railroad. And he was using explosives, and this tamping iron was what he was using to very gently tap the black powder down into the hole. And he wasn't gentle enough on one occasion, and it blew right through his skull. And so what you see next to him, next to the tamping iron there, is actually the skull of Phineas Gage with a hole through it. You can kind of see the hole in the background. But the thing about this terrible, terrible accident is that Phineas Gage survived. And he not only survived, but he was still able to function in most ways, except, according to one of his doctors, it strangely affected his mood and possibly his moral judgment. That was a speculative aspect. But the idea is that here we have a terrible accident that has given us insight into how our cognition is linked to our physicality or our brain. It weighed in on a debate that was happening at the time. You see next to the tamping iron a picture of a phrenological chart. And phrenology at the time was very popular, this idea that you could somehow say something about someone's personality and their character and about the shape of their skull. Well, Phineas raised questions about this, because if Gage could survive, even though he was no longer Gage, then it's not the skull that was having the impact here or that was making the difference, but rather the interior of the skull, the brain itself. So Phineas became he played a role in this debate in how we think and where we think mostly. But also he really kind of started a tradition, if I want to say, in neuroscience and in later cognitive science, in this idea that at some point the world is going to push up against us. And even if we can't investigate certain things, because we can't just poke holes in people's brains when we like, for various reasons, when accidents do happen, we can take advantage of this. What could have been a terrible accident with no fruitful outcome turns into the origins, some might say, of our compartment theory of the mind. Again, this is a bit of a matter of debate. So I don't want to put any conclusions on whether Phineas was definitive or not, but you can read up on that. But there's this idea that what happens when we want to find out about how we think is that we're going to, at some point, butt up against the world. And when we do that, they will reveal something about us. Serendipity ties into this kind of scientific realism in a very interesting way. So often when we say science can be discovered by accident, it buys into this rhetoric, or it amplifies or encourages this idea that we will trip over the world at some point. And especially brilliant scientists will recognize it when it happens. So there's this idea that the world exerts a pressure, and this comes into play in Merton's definition of the serendipity pattern. So here you have his 1948 definition he talks about several patterns that occur in empirical research in sociology. And one of them is the serendipity pattern, and he defines that as the unanticipated, anomalous, and strategic datum that exerts a pressure for initiating theory. So I'm going to put a pin in strategic for later. And at the moment, I actually want to focus on this idea of exerting a pressure that the world will push against us and will tell us something about itself as we investigate. This has done two things in the history of cognitive science and neuroscience and all of these various sciences that originated as one and then have branched off quite distinctly in recent years. But this idea that the datum or the world will guide us towards scientific progress or towards the truth. First, that as I mentioned, it kind of underlying that is this idea of scientific realism, that there's a real world out there and that our best skills are developed in observation and our ability to observe and recognize significance when we see it. But it also emphasizes, especially in the kind of origins of our understanding of the mind and brain, this physical connection that we have to understanding cognition. And this is something that we are pushing out of now, but part of its origins is in the fact that serendipity played such a key role in the beginning phases of understanding our mind and brain. When we did understand the connections between the mind and brain, we understood them in very brute physical ways, like when railroad spikes crashed through skulls, and we were able to then observe what happened. This didn't stop with Phineas Gage. It continues on today with current techniques in neuroscience. So I wrote my thesis on a case from deep brain stimulation. And deep brain stimulation and the history of neurosurgery is just replete with accidents. Deep brain stimulation is popular today for movement disorders, principally. But how this was discovered, if you read especially the biography of Dr. Irving Cooper, who was a neurosurgeon in the States, he accidentally nicked a carotid artery once while he was operating on someone with a tremor. Nearly fatal mistake. He managed to recover within operation, patch up the guy, and then discovered that his tremor had also disappeared. So now we have confirmation of an increasingly compartmental idea of the brain, where different regions of the brain are associated strongly with different functions, whether they're cognitive functions or physical functions. And movement disorders present this wonderful connection between our brain and our body. And it's demonstrated by accident, as we see that when we affect certain parts of the brain, it has it's a very distinct and immediate physical effect when this happens with movement disorders. I strongly encourage you to look for DBS videos online, because you can actually see the tremor stop once the stimulation begins. And it's just such an immediate connection with the world. It brings in, again, this realism, this idea that we can pursue our investigation of the world directly by observing. And accidents confirm that again and again in this kind of scientific approach. So a nicked choroidal artery turned into lesion therapy. In other words, they would burn off or break off parts of the brain in order to affect movement disorders and create therapeutic effects in people. When it worked, it took a fair bit of investigation to get the right regions of the brain, and ultimately evolved into a use of electricity in order to create these lesions, which then accidentally, when electricity was left on long enough and someone realized, Dr. Benavieve actually realized that we didn't actually need to electrically cut the brain, we could just continue the stimulation. And we created a new treatment line, which is deep brain stimulation. And so we have this ongoing interaction between direct observation of the effects of our interventions on the brain, whether they're accidental or planned. And then from there, we build theory. So deep brain stimulation has now given rise to a whole new range of theories. Never before have we gained observational insight into the interior of the brain like this. What you see on the screen is an electric rod. It's just a very artistic representation of what actually happens. But the rod down through the center is representing the electric rod that is inserted right deep into the brain, into the hypothalamus, the thalamus. We're talking very central regions. And then stimulus is created by electricity and it's adjusted. Well, as we've stimulated different parts of the brain in order to treat different disorders, we've also made discoveries about what the brain is. And at this point, we've gone from seeing the brain as, being the pineal gland, the physical link to our otherworldly spiritual self. We've developed compartmental theories where we have, movement and we have cognition kind of taking up different regions of the brain, but being fairly distinct and determinable. And now we're looking at a systemic idea of the brain and how it relates to cognition and our physicality and how those two things interrelate. So our very physical understanding of the brain has come a long way by these continuing accidental observations. And the one that I wrote about in my thesis was a memory-based observation made during a treatment for obesity. It's a classic serendipity case. We are pursuing observations in one field and we make an observation in another field, and they were able to follow it up and now have evolved a new set of theoretical insights based on this single serendipitous observation. So serendipity continues to influence our direction in understanding how mental disorders develop, what it's now being applied to obsessive compulsive disorder, depression, etc., where we're talking about the systemic understandings of how the brain works and how it interacts with the world. So it keeps going. And but what I want to do is kind of turn a little bit here, because what I've talked about so far is how serendipity has played a role as almost a scientific method, right? It's inspired us, it's pushed up against us, it's tripped up our curiosity and made us investigate further. We've been required to perform abductions and form hypotheses in order to explain it. And we have very much this scientific realism. The world pushes us, we push back with theory kind of approach. And this comes out of Merton's definition when we emphasize that the exertion of pressure that the datum has upon us, that the world has upon us. But when we look at another instance of serendipity in ongoing neuroscience, and I wanted to talk about the default mode network, which is a very current example. So in 2012, a very nice article was published, The Serendipitous Discovery of the Brain's Default Network, and it gives a really nice review. There's lots of points in there I'm actually not going to be able to touch on today, but we'll get into a couple. But as deep brain stimulation is evolving, right, we also have the development of better and better imaging techniques. And again, here technology is giving us access to a different way of understanding our relationship between our physical bodies and our cognition. And when we use fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, then we can detect which parts of the brain are active. I won't get into the soundness of the methodology or the issues with experimental setup, which is another issue. But let's go with what general theories that they've been able to notice as they've been doing this research, one of which is the default mode network. And this can be described as a serendipitous discovery that comes out of this new line, a new methodology in cognition research. When observing active tasks, so people who are performing active cognitions, they're given a specific task that is meant to trigger a specific part of the brain in order to draw relationships out between that part of the brain and that type of cognition. While measuring this, they had control. You have to have a control. And so what was often used for a control was a passive cognitive task. So you would be asked to sit there and stare at a crosshairs, for example, on a screen for a period of time. Or you were asked to be in a state of rest, so not actually thinking about anything. But this wasn't working as a very good control, because these passive tasks, and even at rest, tended to trigger very strong activity in other parts of the brain, which then interfered with the results. So you couldn't tell what was the most active, whether there was this one part was only active during the cognition task, then it was fairly clear. But if there was an overlap between activity in the cognition task and the control task, well, then you have a scientific problem. And so it was a matter of debate what to do with this noise. It's noise, it was a problem. And over time, through these discussions, it became apparent that the noise was itself worthy of investigation, that the patterns of activity that were rising up as noise in the control group were actually also detectable as patterns. They were patterns of activity. It wasn't simply random activity. And yet what was happening, cognitively speaking, during that time was either random or so directed that it was meant to still cognition. And yet we have these strong points of activity. And so what you see up here is an illustration of the connections between the nodes of highest activity during the default mode itself is activated. And the default mode is activated, these regions of the brain are in higher active periods during passive thinking time. So when you're not supposed to be thinking about anything, when you're wandering, there's specific regions of your brain that do that wandering for you, apparently. Now, why did we, or the authors, I have in this quotation here, initially place so much emphasis on these mysterious increases in activity in passive tasks? And here's where serendipity becomes less a direct encounter with the world and more a mediated set of observations that we make while we are engaging the world and we are trying to understand what we're observing. So while trying to understand one thing, people were generally ignoring the other thing. They were seeing it as noise, it was interference, it was messing with their controls. It was messing with their theories about what counted as an active and a passive cognitive task. And then that meant it was not acceptable at first. It was difficult for it to enter as an actual observation in itself, for the pattern that it was portraying to be seen as something that we could focus on and that we could learn from instead. And this kind of push tells us something about serendipity itself, that it's not only the world exerting a pressure upon us, but also that pressure and the interpretation of that, what we're observing, that datum that Merton calls attention to, is that it's strategic. And what does Merton mean by strategic? This is such an interesting thing that often gets left out of our understandings of how Merton engaged serendipity in his theory. Strategic, according to Merton, is the part of this definition that the observer, or what he says, what the observer brings to the datum. So it's not about the datum, it's not about what the world is showing us, it's about what the observer is bringing to that encounter with the datum. So here we have an interaction that is necessary for the serendipity pattern to occur, right? So it has to be unanticipated, it has to be anomalous, it has to be unexpected or a surprise. It also has to be something weird that inspires our curiosity, but it also has to be strategic. And for Merton, being strategic obviously requires what he calls a theoretically sensitized observer to detect the universal in the particular. So it's not simply recognition of the thing itself, but it's recognition of its potential value in relation to current theory. Now that strategic nature can be a little bit slow in coming. So we might see something as unanticipated and anomalous fairly early on, but it doesn't get to be strategic until we recognize it as potentially valuable. And that may happen immediately, but often it takes a while, like the default mode network. It took a while for it to integrate itself enough into the discussions. And here I want to emphasize, if you do go back to the 2012 article, you'll see discussions amongst colleagues and reading of each other's papers played a key role in bringing this pattern to the surface as a pattern. So you have this kind of social engagement and textual engagement, which I'll mention in my last slide. And I'm just checking my time. But the other cool thing that I want to step away for just a second is how cool is the default mode network? I mean, as far as serendipity goes. So the default mode network is observed as being in high activity while we are specifically left undisturbed and let our minds wander. And our brain is just going. It's just going in the background. And the kinds of things that they suggest that it brings up is possibly its most, I just wanted a quotation here. Now I can't find it in my things. So one quotation from a 1995 paper about this is that apparently when the brain mind thinks in a free and unencumbered fashion, it uses its most human and complex parts. And here they want to point out that the areas of the default mode network are also the more recent ones to evolve. They're the last ones to I'm going to say this wrong, millenniate. I never say that word right, but the coding that comes onto the neural network comes last into this region. So it's the most evolutionary, most recent development. So why is that the most recent parts, the most supposedly highly developed parts are the ones that let us wander the best, right? What kinds of higher order processes might be involved here? And they really think that it has a play, that the key role it plays in cognition is our ability to imagine alternative scenarios, like things that might happen in the future, or the kinds of things that allow us to have empathy, or the kinds of things that allow us to move past what might be an error or a mistake under one interpretation, but can be seen as potentially valuable from a different perspective. So this ability to shift in perspectives. Now, I'm not saying anything about the conclusiveness of this science, because it is all very exciting and still being formed. But this idea that we might have like a network that's actually devoted to mind wandering, I find very intriguing to the idea of serendipity itself. And what does it say? So it says two things to me. First, when we look at the way in which our understanding of the default mode network, as well as other understandings of how the brain and mind are working together, have come about by accident, I think what it's saying is that what we need to do is look to the noise. That the noise is often where we're going to see something that has value, but is unexpected. So we have to, instead of immediately dismissing it, right, or trying to theorize about it, in order to allow for something like a paradigm shift, a really new knowledge to happen, we have to see it as something that we can focus on in itself. So what do we perceive as noise? What counts as noise? What counts as the kinds of things we need to focus on? In our science itself is something that serendipity calls attention to. And it does that just by itself. Accidents can happen. We need to pay attention to the noise. This is just serendipity kind of in general. But when we think about serendipity within the brain as possibly what we need, what the default mode network does, right? If serendipity happens anywhere, it's going to happen in the network where, you know, random thoughts are supposed to clutter together, where we drift into our deep memories, and where we put things together in unplanned order, where we're not focused on anything particular. But what does this say about how we think? What does this say about our cognition in general? Now, notice the default mode network is not only activated when we're not thinking. It is also activated in specific problems where we are asked to think about alternative scenarios. So we can think of it as not just something that happens only on its own, but as something that we can call into play when we want to. So it gives us this idea that there might be a way to strategize about how to be serendipitous, about how to bring serendipity into our way of thinking, into our very understanding of rationality and how we use serendipity to be rational or to form new ideas or to be creative. This time might get us somewhere with that. But I think more importantly, it raises three really cool questions. So can we think about the default mode as a kind of serendipity strategy? This ability to allow our mind to wander in specific ways. Is this something we can tap into? So then we want to ask ourselves, what's the difference between a wandering mind and a perceiving mind? So we often think of serendipity as by association or as a cognitive connection. We think of it as an entirely internalist crashing together of two ideas. But in serendipity narratives and in the stories we hear, there's an encounter with the world. And I talked about this a bit in the beginning. But how do we flip between these two things? And where does the wandering mind and the perceiving mind come in? What is the difference between passively perceiving something, allowing your mind to wander? And I feel like there might be overlaps there that are very interesting in our understanding of cognition. And then we want to think about what kinds of triggers can play a role. And I take the word triggers from the work of Laurie McKay Peet, and she's written a fairly recent paper with Peter Wells in 2016, I've got cited there, on serendipity in the sciences, where they talk about triggers and how they actually happen in scientific research from the perspective of practicing scientists. But this idea of a trigger, of something that can bring serendipity into play, how do they play a role when can we happen across an internal trigger? If our minds are wandering and we hit across the right memory, is that an internal trigger? Is there something, and can we plant these? Can we somehow integrate those into our cognition and into our understanding? Or do we do this? Do we create triggers for ourselves in order to set our minds to wandering in the right ways at the right times? And I feel like artists might have something to contribute to this, but also philosophers, quite frankly. And then finally, do our minds need to be wandering? Does this something like the default mode have to be engaged for us to perceive triggers or encounters as triggers? And here I want to bring in these social and textual triggers that McKay Peet and Wells bring up. And it's in other literature as well. But this idea, and you see it in the story told by Bruckner about the discovery of the default mode network, that social encounters, not only between colleagues, but between strangers, and textual triggers, so the right book or the right paragraph or the right poem even, can put memories and ideas together in different ways. But do our minds need to be wandering in order to be susceptible to such triggers? Or can we also catch them while we're being focused? And I'd be interested in looking further into that in a cognitive science perspective, in the sense that that might give us some way of differentiating, these kinds of moments between, what is going to count, what is going to end up being serendipitous, and what falls under the scientific method. How do we separate these two things, these kind of intentional versus unintentional? And I wonder, I just wonder what the intentionality role there is, and whether something like the default mode network might allow us to understand in a different way the role of wandering in our active cognition.